Welcome to Bootstrappers, a program designed to bring you up-to-the-minute ideas and concepts to understand what it takes to succeed in business and life. Each week, we'll bring you guests and ideas you can't find anywhere else. Bootstrappers is a production of Anequim, LLC. Now strap on those business boots and join Bootstrappers with Jeremy and Gwenn Aspen.
Welcome to this episode of Bootstrappers. I'm your host, Gwenn Aspen, with my spouse.
That's me, Jeremy.
Aspen. I'm president of Anequim. Jeremy is president of Wistar Group Property Management here in Omaha, Nebraska. And if you haven't been to Bootstrappers before, we review concepts and ideas from successful entrepreneurs in all arenas and then try to bring those concepts down to our industry of investment property management. So today we're lucky enough to have a wonderful guest with us, Jerry Reimer. And Jerry is a developer here in the Omaha area, and he's developed all kinds of
You've seen his work.
Projects. Yeah,
You've definitely seen it.
From Urban Village, where he developed some older buildings and made them gentrified and absolutely gorgeous, to new developments like 1010 on the lake and the bungalows at Prairie Queen. Am I saying that right? At Prairie Queen, which is your newest project, right? Mm-hmm. And Jerry has one of the most interesting career trajectories of anybody I know, starting out in consulting and then moving on to entrepreneurship. So we're going to talk to him a little bit about how he chose to make those career transitions. And then also just talk about how does someone even get into developing brand new properties? Because that's nothing that Jeremy and I have ever done before. And
that's not because we're smarter. It's because we don't know how to do it, right?
Well, and then one of the other things that I love about Jerry's work is everything that he's developing right now is very intentional, and they're properties that people genuinely want to live in. And so we're going to talk about some design strategies. So it is going to be a jam-packed episode, and with that, we want to welcome you, Jerry. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
Oh, yeah. No, we're excited. So we just want to talk to you about how the heck you, first of all, ended up in Omaha, mm-hmm. and how you go from being a consultant at Deloitte to saying, you know what, I'm going to throw this cushy job out the window and just throw caution to the wind and start my own business.
Was Deloitte cushy?
Yeah, I'm not sure the people at Deloitte would consider their jobs cushy.
It's a lot of hours, is my understanding. But,
so anyway, with that, just
I think I was looking for a cushy job is why I left Deloitte.
Tell us a little bit about your path.
Yeah, so I'm actually from Omaha. I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. My father was a drywaller, and he really didn't have a retirement. So when I was 8 years old, the story goes they inherited $500, and they were either going to buy a new dining room set or they were going to invest it. And apparently my mother refused to put the money in the bank because then it'd be with all the other money. She left the check in the cabinet for weeks and months, and my father would get angry that somebody's going to come steal the money. And so eventually she used that $500 to buy a 4-unit apartment building. At the time, as an 8-year-old, I did not know there was such a thing as a property management industry. I just became, part of the family. My mother was the leasing agent. My dad was the maintenance man. I painted, cleaned, pulled, weeds in the yard. And so I just thought that's what owners did. I didn't really know there was a great company like Wistar or anything like that even available.
So that's how you got. That's your first introduction. Did your mom and dad, did they buy other properties following that fourplex?
So they, over the years, they have 20 units today. They bought that first fourplex in 1975. They still own it. I believe they're actually next to some properties you guys may own here locally.
Oh, really?
You may manage here locally. But they bought one, and over a few years later, they bought another one. And again, as a young person growing up, I thought that owning apartments and investing seemed like a better deal than being a drywaller. And so I asked them why they didn't buy more properties. And they're like, hey, you don't understand. It takes a lot of down payment money. We just don't have that kind of money. And so I really started to aspire of how could I save more money? How could I save money faster than a normal person? And somewhere, I had a lawn service as a kid. I mowed lots of lawns. And one of my lawn mowing customers one day asked what I wanted to do. And I told her that I wanted to study international business. Somewhere along the lines, I had realized that if I could get sent abroad, oftentimes the companies will pay for your housing, give you a stipend. And at the time, there was also some tax advantages. Like the first $70,000 of my income was not taxable when I lived abroad in the past. And so long story short, I ended up pursuing a path to try to work in Japan because the yen was very strong. I like to say I was a migrant worker, but instead of chasing the dollar, I chased the yen, and I literally worked in Tokyo, would save my paycheck. The company was paying for my housing. The company was giving me $100 a day spending money, and I would send my money back to Omaha, and I would buy a duplex and a fourplex, and at the time my parents would manage it and fix it and take care of it, and they got frustrated. They're like, "You're just buying us work."
So, we've known each other for a while, but that part of our story is almost identical. Like, I did the same thing. I lived overseas. Well, I lived in Mexico. And what do you do with your money when you're in Mexico? I mean, there's literally nothing left to spend it on if you're an expat. So you send your money back to the United States and you put it into properties.
Yeah. So
anybody that's looking to get into real estate, just go get a job in another country.
And did you know Japanese before you went?
Yeah, I thought so.
Did it really turn out that way?
I was lying to myself.
No, but how did you learn it? So one thing I do not like about American school system is that the language, the language courses, it's really bad. You don't ever leave high school speaking Spanish or French. Japanese, though, nobody even teaches it here locally that I know of. That can't be true, but.
I had studied a little bit of Japanese language at University of Nebraska, Omaha.
Okay.
I had took an intensive language program over the summer and by no means was well-versed in Japanese. The most effective thing I did was, so ultimately I got a scholarship from the Japanese Ministry of Education while I was in undergrad to study in Japan. And so I went to Japan initially for a year. It ultimately got extended to a year and a half, but getting a Japanese girlfriend was the most effective way for me to learn Japanese.
Right. Because you can say, you learn how to say please.
I remember.
Please.
Stop.
I actually remember the first time I had to practice asking her how to, go out to have a drink. And so she then said yes, but then we couldn't have a conversation after that, so it wasn't that effective.
But it was the stepping stones to a big long, because you ended up leaving with the language, right?
I did.
And the thing about learning a language, anybody that wants to know, is you have to mess up a million times. Like the faster you make your mistakes, the sooner you learn the language. That probably applies to a lot of stuff, but when I learned Spanish, I just wasn't afraid to look like an idiot because the girls liked that.
We all have kids, and our kids kind of dabble in entrepreneurism here and there. But I think that's an interesting guiding principle. Learn another language if you want to be an investment property owner, because I still think it applies today.
I think it does too, and perhaps it applies to me. I think applies in the following way. One of my core values for my family and also for my company is to be open to possibilities. And I think anyone that goes abroad is inherently open to possibilities. And I do think to be a successful entrepreneur, to take risk and to develop properties or even to buy, own, and invest, there is an element that a personality type has to be open to possibilities, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So.
Very cool. So then you're in Japan, and then what happened?
Yeah, so I studied in Japan. I came home from undergrad, graduated, and my first job out of school was with Honda Research and Development. It was in Marysville, Ohio. They had just started the R&D center. There were 40 Japanese and about 20 young Americans that were educated in Japan.
Oh, cool.
And we all spoke Japanese. Our bosses all spoke Japanese. The computer systems were online in Japan. And I used to think I was perhaps on Star Trek because literally the R&D center was in the middle of a cornfield. So you would leave America, go into the building, put on your Japanese uniform. Computers were online. They'd smoke in the cafeteria, rice, miso soup in the cafeteria.
Crazy.
And at night you'd go back out and it's like, beam me home, Scotty. I'm back in America.
That's cool.
And so I did that for 3.5 years. And then I got went to during that time, I lived in Marysville, which was a small town. Most of the young people would have chosen to live in Columbus or the suburb Dublin, but I chose Marysville because I could afford to buy a beat-up, cheap duplex. And so on nights and weekends, I would tear out the lath and plaster and attempt to remodel the one side, and ultimately got it done, rented it out. I then ultimately remodeled the side I was in. I remember I put a bunch of plastic up and partitioned off the bedroom and gutted the rest of the place. So ultimately, I was able to profit enough on that building to sell it and have enough money to go to grad school. So 3.5 years in, I quit my job. My father thought that was a terrible decision. He's like, you've got a great job, you get holidays, you work inside, there's air conditioning.
Right, yeah.
Because he was used to working out in the heat or the cold. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, I think I'll be okay. And so ultimately went to graduate school, and upon completing graduate school, I had
Thunderbird.
Yep, at Thunderbird, which is an international business school. And I had good job offers.
In Arizona.
Yep, in Arizona. When I came out of grad school, I had job offers from Intel, General Motors, Cargill, and a company called EDS, Electronic Data Systems. It was the company that Ross Perot had started. It was owned by General Motors at that time. But the cincher for me was if I went to work for EDS, they would send me back to Tokyo to work.
And you wanted
and
to
I
go
wanted
back.
I wanted that expat job so that I could save more money. I was on a very convoluted path to get to real estate. For some reason, I was like, I need to save money. I need down payment money. At the time, I didn't realize that I could perhaps, solicit investors, raise money, do some different things, create value. So I took a long path.
But don't you think working in corporate America gave you a skill set that you wouldn't have gotten had you gone straight to real estate and done it on your own? Are you glad that you kind of took that convoluted path?
Absolutely. I think it's been one of the reasons we have been able to grow. I still consider ourselves a pretty small business. 10 years ago, when I finally kind of got out of corporate America for good, I had 80 units at that time. We're now up to 1,200 units, which, by industry standards would be considered very, very small. But the growth that we've been able to experience in systems, processes, team, things that we are successfully putting in place now, much of that experience came from my corporate experience.
So when you were at Honda, you guys at the time, wasn't it TQM or TQI, Total Quality Improvement, and then the logistics system, what was it? It was
Just-in-time
Just
delivery.
in time. So layered on top of that, at least when I was in the industry, I did international logistics. We had ISO. Did you guys do ISO?
Sure.
So you had written documents, and that's one thing, and that's what I kind of want to encourage our listeners and viewers to understand, is that the corporate world is a perfect opportunity to learn how processes and procedures being written down can actually make your company better.
Sure.
And actually, without it, your company can never get to a point where you can really probably even sell it.
Yeah,
That's
I think another advantage is, one of the things I learned as a small business person is sometimes it's hard to go put all those systems and processes in place because you don't necessarily have enough scale when you only have 4, 10, 20, even 80 units. And that's where using, a company such as yours, where you can offer the benefit of those systems and processes, and I can just go plug in with my 80 units. Maybe once I get to 1,200, 10,000, I can build some of my own system or my own documentation. But I do think one of the keys to success was we learned how to buy into those subject matter experts.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We are here with Jerry Reimer. This is Bootstrappers.
Let's tell them where those are, because you've driven by it and you've seen it. So Leavenworth, over there by the interstate, how many units do you have right there at the...
Yeah, so within a 6-block radius of Midtown Crossing in the Midtown area of Omaha, we have about 690 units.
It's those old buildings that were dilapidated, they turned them around. Then you've got 1010 on the lake, that's out west.
192nd and Dodge Street, there's approximately 200 units there. And then we're in process of developing, it's a 650-unit master plan in Papillion, right by the Prairie Queen Reservoir. We call that Bungalows on the Lake.
So that's Jerry Reimer.
And so before we left for break, we were talking about how Jerry developed his real estate empire the way many of us have in the industry, where he just saved money, bought properties, made them beautiful, and then rented them out.
I can't believe Jerry called it an empire.
He didn't call it an empire. I'm calling it an empire.
As she called it empire, I was thinking House of Cards.
I was too. That was fun.
So I mean, Jeremy, that's our story too. We had corporate jobs, and on the weekends we'd, get our paint clothes on and fix everything up ourselves and flip houses on the weekends, and some of them would become rentals. But one of the things you've been able to do is progress out of that kind of lifestyle, because it's a grind and it's definitely a lifestyle, into developing unbelievable properties and getting investors to work with you. Can you tell us how you made that switch?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it was just a lot of luck. I do remember, I think it was the year 2007 or so. My wife and I both had full-time jobs. We had young children, and like you guys, we were painting, cleaning, leasing, managing our own units. And I think that year we turned 26 units, so about one every other weekend. And that was an important turning point. One day my wife came to me and said, "Jerry, I support your dream, but I'm no longer going to live in it." So
I quit.
Brilliant.
I do not do this anymore.
I quit your damn dream.
Yes.
Your dream is yours.
So that caused me to hire my first weekend employee. So I hired a guy to work with me to help paint and clean the units. And the really fortuitous time for me came from a couple of different ways. One, when I got out of corporate America, I transitioned to another entrepreneurial firm, a guy named Corey Weedle. He had done GNCs, Complete Nutritions, and he was just an entrepreneurial through and through. Yes. And that was a great adjustment to see. It was almost shocking to me, that level of enthusiasm and entrepreneurialism and quickness compared to the corporate pace that I had been accustomed to. So getting that jolt ended up, I think, actually being a critical step to get me out of the corporate mentality and into an entrepreneurial mentality.
So just to clarify, you worked for Jerry or for Corey, or you just met him and you were just talking?
No, I actually went to work for Corey for
I did not know
couple of years.
Wow.
Maybe it wasn't a couple of years, 1 year or two or so. I don't remember at this point, but it was a great learning opportunity, a great transition for me. And anyway, from there, I had 80 units at that time, and I had built a 15-unit building from scratch and a 12-unit building from scratch while working my day job, at Deloitte or something on the weekends.
Sleep? I mean,
damn.
Not much.
And you had little kids too.
Yes, yeah. So I literally remember, and this was the day, some of the subcontractors back then would have still been using fax. Corporate America would have been using email. So I'd be up at 5 o'clock in the morning faxing all the subcontractors, do this, here's the schedule, orders, and so forth. And then, go to my day job. Then at night I'd come back home and do that. So anyway, there was a turning point for me fortuitously in 2000s, kind of 7, 8. A commercial real estate broker introduced me to my urban village partner, Scott. And I remember I really wasn't looking for a partner. I wasn't looking for an investor. My parents had taught me that it wasn't good to have partners or investors. It didn't work out. Very much, mom and pop, old school. You got to do everything yourself. Nobody's going to do it as good as you can do it. You can't trust other people to give, that quality.
Good Midwestern values.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, we're
Which
kind
go
of
a long way.
We're kind of like that. We're kind of more the mom and pop. We don't have any investors in some of our companies, and it's just kind of the bootstrapping approach. But this is the entry into being able to do big things.
It gave me a different world because ultimately I was introduced to Scott. I think 6 months went by. We kind of hung out. We kind of didn't decide to do anything.
So you were hanging out as friends?
Acquaintances.
Okay.
Right. I mean, we got introduced. I was showing him what I do, showing him how I, had some success, where I failed. I was doing an 8-unit building in Midtown, which ultimately became the urban village model at the time. And anyway, one day he said,
"So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
This is mostly for Omaha listeners, but so you had already invested in that neighborhood without having the assurance that you'd be doing the rest of the neighborhood?
Yep, at 38th and Pacific near Field Club Country Club Golf Course.
Yeah.
I bought a dilapidated building at a foreclosure sale, an 8-unit building for $50,000. Won it on the courtroom steps, and didn't know what I was getting into.
And for people who are in the Omaha area, that was kind of a rough part of town at the time.
Yeah.
And what Jerry has been able to do with that neighborhood since then is take a bunch of houses in the same area and develop them all nicely so that the whole neighborhood kind of acted as a microcosm of I don't know.
It was a build them and they will come kind of approach, because there was no reason to believe.
But I talked to you back then, and I remember you were like, but the interstate is right here, and people can get everywhere around the city. So you're very strategic about choosing that neighborhood.
We were. And again, I will give Scott a lot of credit for that. He had come from Denver. He had seen other urban markets turn around. And, my mother had really taught us a policy, if you will, or a core value. We wouldn't own any apartments that we wouldn't live in ourselves. We wouldn't put anything into an apartment we wouldn't put in our own house. So when I went into Midtown that first time, I just built it out like I would want to live in it myself. At the time, we looked around the area, and there's great jobs. There's Fortune 500 companies. There's Kiewit, there's Brookshire, there's Mutual of Omaha, there's UNMC. And so we sat there and was like, is the neighborhood the problem, or is the product the problem? And we just thought that there was enough depreciated product that, in fact, it wasn't a, quote, bad neighborhood. I do think sometimes culturally, Americans may associate the quality of real estate product and label a neighborhood. And again, I was like, this isn't a bad neighborhood. These aren't bad people. There's great jobs. And so we built a product, 8 units, like we'd want to live in it. And they rented quickly. Ultimately, that is what Scott saw, and he's like, let's go do more of that. And I'm like, we can go do more of it, but I don't want to go do slum landlord. I don't want to go put lipstick on the pig. We're going to go in there and gut these things, and new HVAC, new insulation, windows, tuck pointing, and really, hold them to our standard. And ultimately, there was a huge pent-up market for that we didn't appreciate was there, but quickly we built into it, and that's really how we got the 690 units in that area. We were very conscientious to keep them within a 6-block radius of Midtown Crossing. The reason
Midtown Crossing, for anyone not from the Omaha area, is a brand new, well, it was at the time, brand new development with beautiful, beautiful condos, apartments, and all the amenities that you could want, restaurants, movie theater, the whole 9 yards. Yeah,
it was a $350 million mixed-use development back, in the time. So
I want to go back to one thing that you said, though, Jerry. You said that you showed Scott the mistakes you had made on the first building. What were those mistakes, and what were you showing, reflecting upon?
I guess, one of the things as an entrepreneur, I think that is important, and for anyone, we're going to make mistakes. And it really, to me, doesn't matter that we make mistakes. It's the fact that we just keep persevering, we adjust. No one's perfect. No one's going to have the perfect playbook. And sometimes I see people are afraid to take action because they're afraid they won't get it right.
Right.
I don't get anything right the first time. But we don't have to stay wrong for very long, right? Let's just get market feedback. Let's learn and keep going.
Yeah, it's like people are searching for their talent, and they will identify their talent as being able to do something the first time. But even Beethoven, who, if you guys don't know who Beethoven is, Beethoven was even, he had to learn. He had to learn how to do it, and then of course he took off, and he was very talented at it. But had he quit because he wasn't good at playing the piano at the front end, we'd not know who Beethoven is.
My thing about making mistakes, too, is that if you are committed to a process, like I'm an obsessive journal writer, so I'm committed to the reflection process and then reiterating and, pivoting if something's not working, apologizing when I screw up. But I think if you're committed to a specific process and you're committed to your principles, ultimately you'll succeed. Even though when you're in the middle of a real big mess up, it doesn't feel that way.
Something that occurs to me is, I think it's a Henry Ford quote, the man who aims at nothing will hit it with amazing accuracy. And so, again, I will give Scott a lot of credit for our success at Urban Village. I remember at one point we'd kind of danced, are we going to do anything or not? And again, I wasn't actively looking for a partner or an investor, but I was also thinking small. And ultimately, he said, hey, are we going to do anything? And I'm like, hey, we can't go do a duplex or a fourplex. It won't feed 2 families, which really represented my limited thinking, shooting for a pretty small target. And I remember him saying, hey, listen, I can bring more money to the table than that. We have to go talk to, these, professional service folks, family office folks. And ultimately, he did help bring more money to the table. And this is where we went and shot for initially about 300 units. And the reason we chose 300 units was we were trying to copy models that already worked. So out in a suburb, you might have a 20-acre development or a 15-acre development with about 300 units on it. And a maintenance man would jump in his golf cart, or a leasing agent in the golf cart, and they'd drive to the back 15 acres and do a showing or do a work order. Well, in our case, by limiting us to a 6-block radius, we could have our maintenance men, leasing folks jump in the car and be to any one of our properties in 3 minutes. So as we went from 8 units to 10 to 20 to 50 to 100, we were starting to get the scale that a large complex would have, even though it didn't look like we had an apartment complex. And because we were gutting them and remodeling them, we could use the same furnaces, the same air conditioners, the same appliance package, same color scheme, decorating scheme. So we ultimately were able to create the the effectiveness of a large suburban portfolio within the missing middle.
Oh, that's so cool. And I definitely want to talk to you more about those design elements, but I do think that's one thing that separates your thought process from others in the industry, is you are very deliberate about what you do. Are there any other things about Urban Village where you were taking properties that were dilapidated and fixing them up that were a big part of your overall design strategy or systemic approach towards development?
So, some of it, I think, went back to the corporate America experience and how do we get repeatability, how do we get scalability, how do we have hot swaps,
Repeatability.
What's that?
Repeatability, is that what you said? Maybe not.
I don't know what's a hot swap.
Well, for example, in the computer world, at EDS, if a computer in an office went down, they would have a brand new one ready to go and have you back up and running with a hot swap in 4 hours. So I learned that, hey, if your air conditioner goes down and we had a brand new one sitting on the shelf, can we go swap it out and fix you and have you back up and running? So it's an example of a service level. And so, again, as we started to cater to a higher end customer and so forth, we were really, for a small business, I like to say R&D stands for rip off and duplicate. So I was, at Honda it was research and development.
Right.
In Jerry's world, it's rip off and duplicate.
That looks like a good idea to steal.
Right. And so again, how could I take some of that corporate experience and some of the great lessons I learned from those and incorporate it back into, frankly, what started off as a mom and pop operation as far as property management or even development or, our small apartment business.
Yeah, that
great.
corporate background, that's what I love about it. I want to ask a quick question. It's kind of a yes or no. Do you journal?
I intermittently do.
Okay.
I'll do it, and then I'll fall off, and then I'll do it again.
Well, we'll say yes. I mean, I think that's the 4th person we've asked, and so far all of them.
Yeah, we have a lot of writers that come on the show.
Yeah.
So this is Bootstrappers. I'm your host, Gwenn Aspen, president of Anequim. I'm here with my spouse, Jeremy Aspen, president of Wistar Group. We're talking to Jerry Reimer. And Jerry is an amazing developer in the area. And I love how Jerry designs his latest community especially, which is bungalows on the lake at Prairie Queen. And I remember years ago when you were conceiving this idea, we were at your house on the lake and you were looking at the designs. And
the old boat.
I was fascinated because for me, it seemed like a brand new concept of how to design multifamily living. And as I was talking to you to get ready for the show, you called it the missing middle. I don't even know at the time that it was known as that when you were developing it. You were really on the forefront of the idea, weren't you? Well, let's talk about what is the missing middle first.
Yeah, so I actually think a guy named Dan with Opticos Design out of Berkeley, California has coined the term missing middle. Missing middle was really product, a multifamily product that would be a duplex, 4-plex, 6-plex, 8-plex. Perhaps it was product that we would all know before the typical garden-style apartment buildings, before the advent of the interstate system, where we really, in the probably late 60s, early 70s, started using the bigger complexes and so forth. And so you would typically find missing middle in an urban type environment. And so when we started developing in Midtown, we weren't really a developer. We were buying old, dilapidated, duplexes, 4-plexes, and 8-plexes. And as we would remodel them, I didn't realize it, but we were in fact assembling a portfolio of now I think what is referred to as the missing middle. It was also missing middle was what my parents had bought when they first started, the 4-plex. Again, I probably was coming at this from perhaps a little bit of a scarcity mentality. Don't have enough money, don't have enough down payment, so can I afford a duplex? fourplex? Can I afford a fourplex? How do I get started? And so that was my original attraction to the missing middle. Ultimately, in Midtown, after we developed for a number of years the Urban Village product, frankly, I was a little exhausted from redeveloping in the urban core. It's a lot more difficult than doing, suburban developments out in the middle of a cornfield. So I used to joke a little bit that I took a vacation and went out and built 200 units on 192nd and Dodge.
That's 1010
on the lake. And hey, why'd you quit doing the urban stuff and go out to the suburbs? And it was like, to rest. It was
it's a little bit more predictable.
Well,
it's
tell us
predictable.
why.
It's just that much easier. There's, it's just.
You don't have to be as smart.
You
right?
don't. You don't. It's easy. I mean, it's not easy.
I know what you're saying.
But relatively speaking, the zoning tends to be in place. The master plans tend to be in place. There's a lot less, stakeholders, neighbors, different groups that are, getting involved.
Not a lot of
and
not a lot of farmers.
1010 on the lake is more of a traditional apartment complex, right?
Absolutely.
And so what happened there is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you saw the things that really worked in the urban core and the things that really bugged you about the new development, and kind of took those irritations and created a third type of development, which is bungalows at Prairie Queen.
Yes, so I wanted there are some advantages of developing in the suburbs. It is repeatable, it is sustainable in the sense that you can find the next piece of land and so forth. But I also found it a little bit boring. There were some things that I really value about, the missing middle, the neighborhood feel.
It's sterile.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And so I kind of thought to myself, could I create a new model for apartment complexes in the suburbs? And to be honest, where this actually came from was I was studying the first building code apparently ever for the apartment industry was a tuberculosis window. So back in the 1800s in New York City, there was a tuberculosis outbreak. And so they issued an RFP and said, we need to come up with this new kind of design instead of these, boxcar units. And ultimately what was developed was what they call a dumbbell building. I realized that I own dumbbell buildings in Midtown. And I thought we were only copying and pasting apartments since the advent of the computers. But I'm like, wait a minute. If we are copying and pasting apartments in the 1800s from New York to the prairie, that was designed in New York City with constraints that were exclusive to New York City. But yet by copying and pasting it into the prairie of Nebraska, we copied and pasted those design constraints.
And when we were at your lake, you were taking pictures of houses in an area of town, Fair Acres here in Omaha, which are these beautiful old 1920s mansions. And you were saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this footprint and make it into a fourplex. And we're going to create an environment that looks like Fair Acres, but it's an apartment. And it just blew my mind. And that's kind of what you did at Bungalows, correct?
This is Bootstrappers. I'm Jeremy Aspen. This is Gwenn, and we're speaking with Jerry Reimer. He's the president of Urban Waters here in town.
Yeah. Yes, it is. So, there's times where I've looked at, large homes in, Omaha or other areas, and you're like, wow, 10 families could live in that house.
Right.
And so one of my thoughts were, could we develop an apartment, quote, complex that if people drove through, they thought they were driving through a neighborhood. Instead of, hey, I live in that apartment building, it's like, wow, your mom lives in that beautiful home, and you decide if you want to tell them that, well, there's 4 other tenants in it or something. So, I don't think we achieve perfection by any means, but our parking lots were designed to look like streets, which I think we did a phenomenal job on. The buildings are, in fact, one of my youngest child's 12. One of his friends came over the other day. We were in that development. He's like, wow, these are cool houses. Now, he's a 12-year-old, right? But I'm like, hey, he knows how to make Jerry happy.
and one of the elements of the construction is that you didn't want any common area interior space because it's really expensive to maintain. It always looks like crap. So
or beds on top of each other, right?
Yeah, bedrooms on top of each other. What are some of the other elements that are non-negotiable for you?
Yeah, so for example, out at 1010, and I think this is pretty common in suburban apartments, you may have 75 to 85% of the overall structure is common space, non-rentable square footage, which to some degree isn't good for the environment. We're kind of wasting space there. So in Prairie Queen, we designed it that 100% of the space is rentable square feet, which also means they all have common doors, private doors. So we didn't necessarily plan this related to the virus, but now our tenants don't have to touch somebody else's doorknob. They don't have to walk by and cough somebody in the hallway.
Oh, what a selling point.
Just another thing that I'm a little bit unusual on here. When I lived in Japan, in the 80s and 90s, it was very common to have bidets, and the Japanese have mastered the technology with their bidets. It's not like the European kind. So we actually put Japanese bidets in all of our apartment units. Yeah. And so when there was a toilet paper shortage, we never ran out.
Oh my gosh,
ahead of the game.
It's crazy. It's like you have a crystal ball.
Because, and if you've not seen Jerry's bidets, which by now you should have a brand.
They're Toto's
because they're
bidets,
all
by the
over
way.
the place. But they're a high-tech piece. Some of our friends
Do
have
they
gotten
break
some of
a
those.
lot?
Actually, knock on wood, we haven't had very many maintenance
And that
issues.
just fascinates me that those things haven't broken.
They're very precise.
They're very, very precise. They nail it.
But no, one of the things, the design is important, and I did really study and think, one of the advantages that I have had. Okay, way too much on the bidets, right?
Sorry.
One of the advantages that I have had, I was the maintenance guy. I answered the calls, the good and the bad. And so as we've tried to develop in a manner that would be peaceful for the investors, peaceful for the property management employees and the residents the best we can. So one of the things Jeremy had referenced earlier, we do make an attempt, and we get this right about 80% of the time, but in our bungalows on the lake design, we've made an attempt not to stack bedrooms. And so there's some common practices in the industry that, you need this for scale, you need this to be cost effective, and we've really challenged some of those assumptions, and I think we've still managed to have a competitive yield to cost for our investors, but yet created a better product for the residents and hopefully a better product for the employees too.
One of the other things I love about your development out there is that I hate the sea of parking in a traditional apartment
same here.
building, and the way that you design the parking, it doesn't feel like you're at a sea parking lot, which I just feel destroys the soul. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about how you design the parking and the green space, because there are rules with this too.
So we have one garage for each unit. Our garages are set up on an alley system, and then again we did design the parking lots to look like streets, so the residents do technically park in the street, which actually is a little bit of an education process, because sometimes in the suburbs we don't associate parking in the streets as a good thing. It's much more common in an urban core, and so we have had to educate that, hey, it's by design. And the other thing parking in the street does is it actually slows the traffic down. In some of our large apartment complexes, you've got a 24-foot wide strip of concrete, and cars drive way too fast through the parking lots, and then there's children and things. And so by parking on the streets, it makes it a little tighter. We've also then put 10-foot medians so that you have nice trees growing. One last thing that is a benefit that I hadn't anticipated by having the street parking, if you will. We have way more windows in all these units than a typical apartment. Because the building might be a 4-plex or a 5-plex, there's often 3 exterior sides to each apartment unit. So you get windows and natural light on 3 sides. So you can now look out your window and just see your car right out, quote, in the street. It's really our parking lot. Unlike a large apartment complex, you go walking down these massive hallways, you have windows on one side of your unit, it doesn't face the parking lot, so it ends up, again, being much homier, much more neighborhoodish.
And having all those windows also probably improves the rentability of them, because people like sunlight, and I've lived in several apartments where sunlight is so hard to find, and so that probably helps them rent more easily.
I think so. It certainly makes it feel more homey. Another thing that we've done, and this may be just a little bit corny, but our kitchen sinks fundamentally have a window. So, it's not uncommon for a house that, you have your kitchen sink and be able to look out a window and see something pretty. Again, apartments don't necessarily do that anymore. It's all this save money, cost effective, yield, and so forth. And so we've really tried to come back with a human scale and rehumanize the product. I feel like in some cases the apartment industry has gotten too commoditized, too institutionalized, and we've taken the human out of the equation.
So as the urban areas are starting to be redeveloped, is it not going to be something that you're not really left with the option of using new material and new designs? You have to kind of take the old, right, or you have to knock stuff down. The higher density, I guess what I'm getting at there is the higher density areas. Is that where the cities are going? Are we starting to lose areas to develop suburban projects?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, most people look at the bungalows on the lake and they assume that I have lower density than a typical suburban apartment complex, but we actually have equal or higher density per units per acre, or specifically, I think it's also perhaps better to measure rentable square feet per acre. And so I actually think we can then leverage the city's infrastructure better. We can reduce suburban sprawl, and so.
So if people want to learn more about the missing middle or look at some cool design elements, do you have any recommendations of where they should go?
Yeah, they should definitely go to Optico's. I'm not sure if it's opticos.com or not, but it's Optico's Design. They're in Berkeley, California. He's got Dan has a new book coming out. By coincidence.
What's his name? Dan what?
Prolik. He's actually from Nebraska by coincidence. So you guys might want to have him on your show
someday.
someday.
Okay, let's do that.
That sounds fun.
And he's got a new book coming out on the missing middle that's supposed to be out this summer. And then sure, I'd love anybody here locally to go take a look at bungalows on the lake.com, and there's some nice pictures, some videos, and things.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is at Prairie Queen down, and is that in La Vista?
It's in Papillion.
Papillion.
And I will also just give a plug. Mayor Black, who's the mayor of Papillion, he loves his city. He works hard for his city every single day, and we would not have been successful developing this type of project without his leadership, vision.
Awesome.
So is this the last segment?
No.
Oh, okay.
So this is Bootstrappers. I'm Gwenn Aspen, your host, president of Anequim. I'm here with my spouse, Jeremy Aspen, president of Wistar Group, and we are here with Jerry Reimer, who is the founder of Urban Waters and the bungalows at Prairie Queen. So I just want to go back to that moment where you decided to get that personal coach, because if you're already in a scarcity mindset, spending the money on a personal coach is one hell of a leap.
I agree.
Right? So how did you decide, I'm going to spend this money on a personal coach?
So it actually happened I was in EO, and as part of this entrepreneur organization, you go on an annual retreat with your forum mates. And we had hired the coach to train us for a couple of days for our learning experience on this retreat. And I was just so impressed with her. And I actually remember that day when we returned, I think we were coming back from Cancun, I actually went and upgraded from coach to first class. And my story was I couldn't afford first class. My story was it was too expensive. And I'm like, that is a scarcity mentality. I need to adopt a mentality that I'll just make more money. The world's abundant. And when I focused the first 40 years of my life on what I didn't have and focused on cutting expenses and keeping things small, I kept things small. And when I started focusing on, well, I'll just make more money, I'll just grow it, I'll just create more opportunities, I want these things, I want those opportunities, I really think the man who aims at nothing will hit it with amazing accuracy.
Which was Zig Ziglar.
Oh, is that who it was?
Yeah.
Okay. And anyway, so
that really was your turning point. You
was.
went on the retreat, you had this amazing coaching experience, and you just said never again.
Yeah, and I continued to, pay $250 an hour or some pretty enormous amount of money for coaching, but again, I saw guys like Corey Weedle or Farhan Khan, and these guys are successful guys, and I just started to say it's R&D again. I'm gonna go rip off and duplicate. I don't know why they're doing it, I don't know why it's working, but I'm just gonna model behaviors of people that are more successful than I am and learn by default.
Oh my gosh, it's so interesting.
I'm Jeremy Aspen. This is Gwenn Aspen, and we're with Jerry Reimer. He's a urban village, urban waters,
and bungalows on the lake at Prairie Queen. So if you were to give advice, because we're wrapping up the show here, to a young entrepreneur right now, your younger self, what kind of advice would you give that person?
I would give them the advice to mentor those around them.
Okay, so start giving first.
Yeah, I do believe that. And I think oftentimes people coach on what they actually need to learn themselves. Mm-hmm. And I do believe you give to get. And the other thing is when you focus on others versus focusing on yourself, I think it's just a happier place to be. It's better energy. The universe is expansive and just good things happen.
Oh my gosh. Well, we are so grateful to have
thanks
Jerry
a million,
Reimer
Jerry. Appreciate you coming
on our
down.
show today. So many nuggets of information. I'm Gwenn Aspen, president of Anequim. I'm here with my spouse, Jeremy Aspen, Wistar Group Property Management. And this is Bootstrappers. Thank you for coming to our episode.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
This has been Bootstrappers, a unique presentation designed to help you better understand what makes the world turn. Contact Gwenn or Jeremy Aspen at hosts@bootstrapper.club. Join us next time on News Talk 1290 KOIL, at our website, or download the podcast.